For decades, Americans believed the truth was protected by law, that power had limits, and that freedom was guaranteed. But what happens when the people sworn to protect the system become the ones hiding the truth? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This is a documented crime hidden for 30 years. This is the crime the FBI hid for 30 years. The beginning of the silence for decades. Americans believed that federal agencies always stood on the right side of history. That when danger appeared, the system responded. But sometimes, the most powerful institutions choose silence instead of truth. This is the story of a crime that did not disappear because it was solved, but because it was buried. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the United States was in turmoil. The Vietnam War divided the nation. Civil rights protests filled the streets. Trust in authority was fragile. Behind closed doors, the FBI launched a series of secret operations meant to protect national security. What the public did not know was how far those operations would go. Files were classified. Names were erased. Lives were quietly destroyed. For nearly 30 years, the truth remained hidden. Locked inside government archives, protected by national security labels. But secrets have a way of surviving longer than lies. At the center of this story was a covert program, later known as COINTELPRO Counterintelligence Program. Officially, it was designed to monitor extremist threats. Unofficially, it crossed a line that many historians now describe as criminal. The FBI secretly targeted American citizens. Not criminals, not foreign agents, but activists, journalists, and political organizers. Homes were bugged without warrants. False letters were sent to destroy reputations. Careers collapsed overnight. And in some cases, lives were permanently altered. Professional hook midpoint. What made this different from normal surveillance was not just secrecy, it was intent. The goal was not to observe. The goal was to neutralize. Entire movements were weakened from the inside. Trust between friends was shattered. Fear replaced freedom, yet the American public knew nothing. Why? Because the documents were sealed. Congress was kept in the dark, and the victims were often portrayed as threats rather than citizens. For years, families suspected something was wrong. Phone lines clicked. Mail arrived already opened. Strangers followed them through quiet streets, but suspicion is not proof. And proof was carefully hidden. Then, in 1971, something unexpected happened. A small group of ordinary citizens broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole files. They copied documents. And they mailed them anonymously to journalists. Those documents exposed the program for the first time. The FBI denied everything. Officials called the papers misleading, dangerous, incomplete. And then, the story faded. Why? Because shortly after, America was consumed by Watergate. Vietnam dominated headlines. The nation moved on. The investigation stalled. The files disappeared again, this time into deeper secrecy. It would take 3 more decades before the full scope of the program was officially acknowledged. In the late 1990s, thousands of pages were finally declassified. Historians were stunned. What they found confirmed long-held fears. Surveillance without oversight. Psychological warfare against citizens. A federal agency operating beyond its legal boundaries. This was not a mistake. It was a system. And for 30 years, it remained hidden in plain sight. This was not just a crime against individuals, it was a crime against trust. When influence became a crime in the early years of the program, the FBI did not begin by looking for violence. They began by looking for voices. Voices that could inspire. Voices that could organize. Voices that could challenge power without firing a single shot. 2 federal investigators. Influence itself was a threat. The targets were not selected at random. They were chosen carefully through speeches, newspaper articles, community meetings, and even private letters. Anyone who could move people was watched. Civil rights leaders, anti-war organizers, journalists, student groups, even musicians. The common factor was not crime, it was impact. Behind closed doors, internal FBI memos used language that rarely appeared in public. Words like disrupt, discredit, and neutralize. These were not arrests. They were strategies. Surveillance teams mapped social circles. Who trusted whom? Who argued with whom? Who could be turned against whom? The goal was simple: break movements from the inside. Agents studied personalities, egos, fears, weaknesses. Then they acted. Anonymous letters were sent to spouses, accusing partners of affairs that never happened. Employers received warnings about employees who were labeled as security risks. Friends were quietly turned into informants, and no one knew who to trust. What made this program so effective wasn't technology, it was psychology. The FBI understood that destroying trust could be more powerful than prison. A leader isolated from supporters was harmless. A movement filled with suspicion would collapse on its own. In some cases, the targets never even knew they were being targeted. A promotion denied, a scholarship rejected, a passport delayed. Each incident looked minor on its own. Together, they formed a pattern of quiet control. Race also played a role, a deeply uncomfortable one. Internal documents revealed that black civil rights organizations were often described as more dangerous than organized crime groups, not because of violence, but because of their ability to mobilize communities. One memo explicitly warned against the rise of messianic figures who could unite people. The fear was not chaos. The fear was unity. Even when no laws were broken, surveillance continued. Files grew thicker. Photos were archived. Phone calls were logged. The assumption was clear. If someone could challenge the system today, they might challenge it harder tomorrow. This logic justified almost anything, and because everything was classified, there was no oversight. Congress did not review the targets. Courts were not informed. The public had no idea. For the people being watched, life became confusing and exhausting. They felt pressure but couldn't name the source. Opportunities vanished without explanation. Relationships strained under invisible weight. Some quit activism entirely. Others spiraled into paranoia, unsure whether threats were real or imagined. That uncertainty was intentional. Fear works best when it has no clear face. The FBI never needed to arrest most of its targets. By the time arrest became possible, many had already been neutralized. Careers ended quietly. Movements fractured momentum deep. And yet, on paper, nothing illegal appeared to have happened. That was the genius and the danger of the system, because influence is difficult to measure and easy to fear. By the mid-1970s, thousands of Americans had files they would never see, lives shaped by decisions made in rooms they would never enter. No warnings, no trials, no accountability, only silence. When the damage couldn't be undone for the people targeted by the program, there was no moment when everything suddenly fell apart. There was no knock on the door, no arrest, no explanation. Instead, their lives unraveled slowly, quietly, in ways that were almost impossible to prove. At first, it felt like bad luck. A job interview that went well, but never called back. A book deal that vanished without explanation. A speaking invitation suddenly canceled. Each incident seemed small, unconnected, coincidental. But over time, patterns began to form. Phones clicked during conversations. Mail arrived, already opened. Friends stopped returning calls. People who had once been surrounded by community now found themselves alone. And isolation was not an accident. Behind the scenes, FBI tactics focused on one goal: make the target doubt themselves. Anonymous letters arrived at workplaces, warning that an employee was unreliable or under investigation. Spouses received messages suggesting infidelity or betrayal. Rumors spread through social circles, carefully designed to look organic. The pressure built quietly. Marriages began to crack under suspicion. Friendships collapsed under paranoia. Some targets withdrew completely, believing they were losing their minds. The most powerful weapon used in this program was not surveillance. It was loneliness. Psychological warfare leaves no bruises, no court records, no headlines, but its impact can last a lifetime. Several individuals later describe constant anxiety, a feeling of being watched even in empty rooms. Others reported depression so severe that daily life became a struggle. In some cases, the consequences were irreversible. Careers that had taken decades to build ended without explanation. Academic reputations were quietly undermined. Creative voices were silenced before they reached their audience. And because the pressure was invisible, many blamed themselves. They believed they had failed, that they were not strong enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough. They never knew a system had been working against them. Families suffered alongside them. Children noticed parents who were suddenly distant, fearful, withdrawn. Households lived under constant stress, unable to explain why everything felt fragile. In a few tragic cases, the damage became fatal. Historical records show that some targets died under circumstances that raised serious questions. Not always violent, but marked by overwhelming psychological strain. Officially, these deaths were never connected to federal actions. Unofficially, historians still debate how much pressure is too much pressure. And that debate continues today. What made accountability nearly impossible was plausible deniability. Every action taken by the program was designed to appear legal on the surface. Letters were unsigned. Informants were unofficial. Surveillance was justified under broad national security claims. If a life collapsed, the system could always say, "We didn't touch them." But the fingerprints were everywhere, just faint enough to deny. When the first documents were leaked in the 1970s, many victims finally understood what had happened to them. For some, it brought relief. They weren't imagining things. They weren't weak. They weren't alone. For others, the realization came too late. The careers were gone. The families broken, the years lost. And still, no one was held responsible. No apologies were issued, no compensation offered, no names publicly attached to the decisions. The silence continued, not because the truth was unknown, but because acknowledging it would mean admitting that power had been abused. For 30 years, that silence protected institutions, not people. And even after the files were released, the damage could not be undone. The question was no longer whether the program existed. That was undeniable. The real question became something far more unsettling. If this could happen once, quietly, legally, and without punishment, what was stopping it from happening again? When power protects itself, by the time the truth began to surface, the evidence was overwhelming. Internal memos, directives signed by senior officials, clear proof that constitutional rights had been violated. And yet, no one was arrested, no trials, no prison sentences, no public reckoning. For many Americans, this became the most disturbing chapter of the story. How could a program that targeted citizens, destroyed lives, and operated in secret for decades end without accountability? The answer lies not in a single decision, but in a system carefully designed to protect itself. When the first investigations began in the mid-1970s, government officials framed the program as a product of its time. A Cold War necessity, an overreaction driven by fear. The language mattered. Be calling it an excess. Rather than a crime, responsibility became abstract. Mistakes were made, but by no one in particular. Legal teams argued that agents were following orders. Supervisors claimed they were protecting national security. And national security, once invoked, became a shield. Congressional hearings followed, televised, highly anticipated, but the most critical details were classified. Witnesses spoke carefully. Documents were redacted. Names were withheld. The public saw fragments, never the full picture. The system wasn't designed to ask who was guilty. It was designed to ask how to move on. Statutes of limitation played a key role. By the time the program was fully exposed, many of the actions were legally too old to prosecute. Years of secrecy had quietly run out the clock, and for those still within legal reach, another defense emerged. Qualified immunity. Agents argued they believed their actions were lawful at the time. Courts often agreed. This created a dangerous precedent, one that legal scholars still debate today. If power believes it is acting for security, who decides when it has gone too far? Political pressure also mattered. No administration wanted to open the door to endless lawsuits, public distrust, or institutional collapse. Prosecuting federal agents would raise questions about every agency, every operation, every classified program. So leaders chose containment over confrontation. Reforms were announced. Guidelines, oversight committees created, but punishment never arrived. For the victims, these reforms felt hollow. Rules changing in the future did nothing to restore lost careers, broken families, or stolen years. Worse still, many victims were never formally notified. They discovered their files decades later, if at all. Some learned the truth only after requesting documents through the Freedom of Information Act. Others never received complete records. Entire sections were blacked out. What remained was a sense of injustice that had no courtroom. Even the language used in official apologies was carefully limited. Statements expressed regret, not guilt. Concern, not responsibility. No names were attached. No consequences followed. And slowly, the story faded from public attention once again. History moved on, but historians did not. Over time, scholars began to describe the episode not as an anomaly, but as a warning, a case study in what happens when secrecy, fear, and authority combine. Because the absence of punishment sends a message. It tells institutions that mistakes can be survived as long as they are hidden long enough. It tells victims that justice is optional, and it tells the public that accountability has limits. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, new technologies emerged. Digital surveillance, data collection, monitoring at a scale previously unimaginable. The question returned quietly, but urgently. Had the lesson truly been learned? Or had the system simply evolved? The truth is uncomfortable. While laws were rewritten and oversight improved, the core dilemma remained unresolved. How much power is too much power, and who gets to decide? A crime that never truly ended by the time the full truth became public. Decades had already passed. The files were declassified. The programs were officially ended. Reforms were announced. On paper, the story was over. But history does not end when documents are released. It ends only when lessons are learned. And this is where the story becomes most uncomfortable. Because the question is no longer what happened. The question is, what did America learn? And what did it ignore? In the years following the exposure, oversight laws were strengthened. Surveillance required more approvals. Intelligence agencies faced tighter rules. At least, that was the promise. But power does not disappear. It adapts. As technology advanced, surveillance no longer required wiretaps and informants. It moved into data, metadata, algorithms. Phones replaced letters. Social media replaced meetings. Digital footprints replaced physical files. And once again, the balance between security and freedom came into question. The danger was never one program. The danger was the belief that fear justifies anything. Supporters of expanded surveillance argue that the world is more dangerous now, that threats are faster, harder to detect, more complex. And they're not entirely wrong. But history offers a warning. When influence is treated as a threat, when dissent is viewed as danger, when secrecy replaces accountability, democracy weakens quietly. The victims of the original program were not perfect people. They were activists, organizers, critics, but they were citizens. And citizenship is supposed to come with protection, not suspicion. What made the crime so powerful was not its scale, but its silence. Most Americans never knew it was happening, and those who suspected it had no proof. That silence allowed the system to continue. Today, that silence looks different. It hides behind terms like data collection and national security. It lives in systems too complex for the average citizen to see, and that raises a critical question. If wrongdoing becomes invisible, how do you resist it? Historians argue that the true legacy of this story is not mistrust, but responsibility. A reminder that institutions are only as ethical as the people watching them. Oversight matters. Journalism matters. Transparency matters. Because power without scrutiny always drifts. Some former officials have acknowledged that lines were crossed. Others insist the actions were necessary. That debate will never fully end. But one fact remains undeniable. For 30 years, a crime existed without consequence, and when a society accepts that, it changes something fundamental. It teaches future leaders that time can erase responsibility, that secrecy can outlast outrage, that silence can be a strategy. Yet history also shows something else. The truth did come out. Not because institutions volunteered it, but because ordinary people demanded it. Citizens who broke into an office, journalists who published uncomfortable stories, historians who refused to forget. That is the other half of the American story. Not blind trust, but constant questioning. Not perfect justice, but persistent effort. The lesson is not that America failed. The lesson is that democracy is fragile and requires participation. Every generation inherits power structures built by the previous one, and every generation must decide whether to accept them as they are, or hold them accountable. The crime this series explored was hidden for 30 years, not because it was impossible to uncover, but because looking for it was inconvenient. And that may be the most important warning of all, because the next abuse of power will not announce itself. It will arrive quietly, legally, wrapped in good intentions. Whether it lasts another 30 years depends on what people are willing to question today. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it remembers who was paying attention and who was not. Freedom is not protected by silence. It is protected by those who refuse to forget. This story is not just about the past. It is about the system we live in today. Because power does not disappear. It waits. And when silence becomes acceptable, history has a way of repeating itself. The truth survived this time because people refused to stop asking questions. Remember this story, because freedom is not protected by silence. It is protected by those who refuse to forget. Subscribe to follow the full documentary series. Some stories are too important to forget.